They thought the skies belonged to them. In 1940, the Luftwaffe ruled Europe. Sleek Messerschmitts, deadly Stukas, and the arrogance of a war machine that believed it was untouchable. From the burning fields of Poland to the skies over France, no air force could match their speed, their precision, or their technology. At least, that's what the world believed. But as German pilots toasted victory in dimly lit mess halls, far from the front lines, engineers, scientists, and intelligence officers in Britain, America, and even occupied Europe were working on something extraordinary. They weren't just building planes. They were rewriting the rules of aerial warfare itself. And within just a few short years, the Luftwaffe's dominance would collapse, not because of numbers, but because of 7 moves, 7 decisions, inventions, and deceptions Germany never saw coming. It all began quietly. No one could have predicted that the first crack in Germany's air supremacy would come not from a new fighter, but from a building on the coast of England, a string of mysterious towers bristling with antennas. The Germans dismissed them as radio stations. In truth, they were Britain's secret eyes, the world's first radar network. As dawn broke on August 13, 1940, Adlertag, or Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe launched its grand assault on Britain. Hundreds of bombers and fighters took off in perfect formation. But long before they reached the English coast, British operators already knew. Blips appeared on screens, silent and ghostly. Fighter command scrambled squadrons before the Germans even crossed the channel. For the first time in history, an entire air defense system was reacting in real time, not to reports from the ground, but to invisible waves bouncing through the air. It was as if Britain could see through the clouds. That was Move 1, and Germany never understood it until it was too late. But this was only the beginning. In Berlin, Luftwaffe commanders were baffled. They believed they were outnumbering the RAF 10-1. Yet somehow, British fighters appeared in exactly the right place, every single time. They suspected spies, even weather luck, but never the truth. Their arrogance blinded them. They believed technology belonged to Germany. The rest of the world, they thought, was playing catch-up. But the Allies were already 2 steps ahead, not just watching, but learning. Because behind every radar blip, every interception, there were mathematicians working to the night, feeding numbers into early computers, calculating interception courses. The Battle of Britain wasn't just fought with Spitfires. It was fought with chalkboards, logic, and a new kind of weapon, data. By 1941, Germany's war machine was expanding east. The Luftwaffe had new enemies now, the vast Soviet Air Force, raw and unorganized. But even here, cracks began to show. German pilots complained that their engines were overheating, that their fuel was unstable. They didn't know it yet, but Allied scientists had already begun working on something that would flip the balance again. A fuel so potent, it would transform slow planes into sky demons. But that story would come later. For now, Germany still believed it held the technological high ground. Their engineers were crafting jet engines in secret. Their designers were sketching rocket planes that could reach the stratosphere. The future looked German, sharp, angular, and unstoppable. Yet somewhere in a dim laboratory in Massachusetts, a group of American scientists was quietly working on something else. Something invisible, intangible, but devastatingly effective. They were developing countermeasures, devices that would turn German radar blind, metal strips dropped from bombers that would create false echoes in the sky, a storm of reflections that would confuse enemy sensors. The code name was Window. When the Germans saw their radar screens explode into chaos for the first time, they didn't know what had happened. Dozens of planes or none at all. The picture was useless. And above that invisible storm, the bombers continued on undetected. Move 2 had landed, and the Luftwaffe's greatest strength, its control of the air, had begun to crumble. But to truly understand how Germany fell from the skies, we need to step back to the arrogance that had built the Luftwaffe itself. The German Air Force wasn't designed for defense. It was a weapon of aggression, built for blitzkrieg, for fast, brutal strikes. Every part of it reflected that philosophy. Fighters with limited range, bombers that could devastate a city, but couldn't cross oceans. Even their fuel chemistry prioritized short, high-output bursts, perfect for conquest, terrible for endurance. When Hitler declared war on the United States, his air marshals didn't flinch. They believed the Atlantic was their ally, that America's air power could never reach them. But across the ocean, another move was already being set in motion, one that would bring German pilots face to face with something they had never imagined, a plane that could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything they had ever seen. It wasn't born in a government lab. It came from the mind of a young engineer with a vision, and it would soon rewrite the story of air superiority. But that, too, would come later. For now, in 1942, the Luftwaffe was stretched thin. Its elite pilots were gone, replaced by rookies flying outdated aircraft. Allied bombing raids were growing deadlier, and the skies above Europe were no longer safe. Every time German engineers tried to answer, the Allies countered. New radar frequencies, new interception tactics, night fighter operations guided by sound, by light, by the faintest radio pulse. And then came something even more terrifying, moves so subtle, so unexpected, that German commanders couldn't even explain their defeats. Because while they looked up at the skies, their enemies were playing a different game entirely. One fought in laboratories, in code rooms, and the hidden frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum. Each move, radar, fuel, jamming, deception, was another thread in a web Germany couldn't see, a silent war unfolding above their own. And as the Luftwaffe began to lose more planes, more pilots, and more confidence, it became clear that the air war was no longer about bravery or skill. It was about intelligence, about who could see first, think faster, and strike without being seen. By 1943, even Hitler's inner circle began to sense it. The skies, once symbols of German dominance, were turning against them. Their aircraft factories bombed, their airfields cratered, their radar stations blinded by Allied trickery. Something was happening, a shift so deep that no one in Berlin could stop it. And yet, the most devastating moves were still to come, because the final blows wouldn't come from the air at all, but from the ground, from the invisible world of physics, chemistry, and intelligence. And when they landed, the Luftwaffe's mighty shadow over Europe would vanish forever. By 1943, the thunder of German engines no longer inspired fear. It signaled desperation. The Luftwaffe, once the sharp edge of blitzkrieg, was now bleeding altitude, fuel, and faith. Their skies, once a playground, had turned into a battlefield of invisible forces. The Allies had turned science into strategy, and one by one, their hidden moves were being revealed. Move 3 was not a weapon. It was a revolution in logistics. While Germany struggled to stretch its air fleet across the vastness of Europe and Russia, the Allies were building an empire of airfields. From the deserts of North Africa to the icy coast of Iceland, from secret runways in England to floating bases in the Pacific, they built what no empire had ever built before, a global air network. This was the unseen advantage. Every raid, every patrol, every escort mission drew power from it. German pilots, forced to fly from bombed-out bases, could only watch as Allied planes came and went with endless reach. And then there was Move 4, the one that made German engineers' blood run cold. It began with a single spark, or rather, a single formula. In 1943, American chemists perfected a high-performance aviation fuel rated at 150 octane. It was volatile, hard to produce, but it changed everything. When poured into the engines of British and American fighters, like the P-51 Mustang, it transformed them into monsters. Planes that once struggled at high altitude could now climb faster, turn sharper, and chase down anything in the sky. German pilots couldn't believe it. Their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, once superior, were being outrun, outclimbed, and outlasted. Luftwaffe intelligence called it impossible. They suspected secret superchargers, new engines, anything but fuel. They were wrong. It was chemistry. The Allies had weaponized fuel itself. And to make it even worse, Germany couldn't copy it. Their refineries were crippled by bombing raids. Their fuel was synthetic, squeezed from coal, unstable and weak. Even the best German engines started knocking, overheating and failing mid-flight. The sky, it seemed, was now powered by science, and Germany was running out of it. But the Allies weren't done. Move 5 was the deadliest trick of all, the war deception. When Allied bombers flew toward Germany, They never flew alone. Invisible squadrons of phantom aircraft accompanied them, ghosts made of radio waves, jamming German radar, confusing their tracking systems. The Germans tried to adjust frequencies, build better receivers, even deploy decoy radars, but it was no use. The Allies had mastered electronic warfare. Every German defense system, from radar to communication, was being blinded, jammed, or misled. The British called their jamming transmitters mandrel and carpet. The Americans used jostle. Their planes carried black boxes that hummed with invisible power, flooding enemy sensors with static. And to finish the illusion, the RAF began using window, thousands of thin aluminum strips scattered in the air, creating false radar echoes. To German operators, the skies looked like a storm of planes, impossible to track. In panic, anti-aircraft batteries fired at ghosts. Real bombers slipped through untouched. It was elegant, terrifying, and brilliant, and the Luftwaffe never found a counter. But perhaps the most haunting move came next. Move 6, the race for the jet. The Germans had the advantage. They had built the world's first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262. It was fast, sleek, unlike anything else in the air. Hitler called it the wonder weapon that would save the Reich. But here's the secret. The Allies already knew about it. British intelligence had pieced together reports from resistance networks, reconnaissance photos, and captured documents. And instead of panicking, they acted strategically. Allied bombers didn't target the jets themselves. They targeted the factories that made their engines. Jet engines require precision materials, high-temperature alloys, exact machining. The Allies bombed every site that could produce them. Without those parts, the Me-262s became hangar queens, powerful but grounded. Germany had invented the future, but couldn't mass-produce it. Meanwhile, Allied engineers quietly worked on their own jet projects, the Gloucester Meteor, the P-80 Shooting Star, keeping pace without revealing too much. By the time the Me-262 reached combat, the war had already turned. And when those jets finally took the skies, they were too few, too late, and too fragile. Allied pilots learned to attack during takeoff and landing, when the jets were most vulnerable. Superior technology couldn't save an empire crumbling from within. Still, one move remained, perhaps the most mysterious of all. Move 7, the invisible code. It didn't fly, it didn't shoot, but it destroyed more German planes than any bullet ever could. Because this move wasn't about machines. It was about minds. Inside a secret mansion in England called Bletchley Park, mathematicians and linguists were doing something no one had ever done before, breaking the unbreakable. The Enigma machine, Germany's most advanced encryption device, was thought to be impenetrable. Every Luftwaffe order, every convoy route, every air defense code passed through it. But the Allies had cracked it. Each time the Luftwaffe planned an operation, British analysts were reading their plans, sometimes before the planes even took off. Entire raids were ambushed before the first bomb dropped. Supply lines were cut. Air reinforcements arrived at empty skies. The Germans suspected leaks, traitors, bad luck, anything but the truth. They never imagined that their own words were betraying them. It was Move 7, the masterstroke, because when you can read your enemy's thoughts, you don't need to outfight him. You outthink him. By 1944, the effect was devastating. The Allies knew where to hit, when to hit, and how to make every blow count. Factories producing synthetic fuel? Gone. Railways moving aircraft parts? Gone. Radar outposts, research labs, communications hubs, all pinpointed and destroyed with surgical precision. German pilots started describing the sky as cursed. Every time they lifted off, it felt as if the enemy already knew. They weren't wrong. The Luftwaffe, once unstoppable, was now blind, deaf, and starving. Its aces, the veterans of the Battle of Britain, were gone. Its new recruits barely knew how to fly. The skies that once roared with the sound of German engines were now haunted by silence, or worse, by the distant thunder of Allied bombers overhead. By late 1944, even Hitler's ministers knew the truth. No miracle weapon, no secret jet could reverse the tide. Germany had lost not just the air, it had lost the future. Each of those 7 moves, radar, deception, jamming, fuel, logistics, intelligence, and code-breaking, had reshaped the war in silence. No grand announcement, no single battle. Just quiet brilliance, patience, and precision. But the story wasn't over yet. Because in the final months of the war, as Berlin burned and the skies filled with smoke, one last move would shatter what remained of the Luftwaffe's pride and make Germany's warplanes fall from By 1945, the once proud Luftwaffe, the spearhead of Hitler's war machine, was no longer a weapon. It was a shadow. Its bases were rubble, its pilots exhausted, its technology crippled by invisible hands. The war in the air had become a mirror of Germany itself, collapsing under the weight of its own ambition and the brilliance of those who had quietly undone it. The final act began with silence, not the silence of peace, but the eerie quiet of skies emptied of defenders. Allied bombers flew across Europe almost unchallenged. Entire cities, once guarded by walls of flak and fighters, now lay exposed beneath waves of destruction. And for the first time, the Luftwaffe couldn't even see the enemy coming. The radar stations that once lined the coasts of France and Germany had gone dark, blinded by constant jamming, shattered by bombing, or fooled by phantom signals. Operators watching confusion as their screens filled with static and ghosts. Planes appeared where none existed and vanished where they were certain attacks were coming. This was the perfection of electronic warfare, the final refinement of moves 4, 5, and 7 combined, invisible power controlling the very perception of battle. And then, the Allies unleashed a move that symbolized the end of the old world. A new kind of bomb, guided not by sight or luck, but by radio waves. The Germans had laughed at the idea of a smart bomb, but now they watched in disbelief as Allied munitions glided toward their targets with uncanny precision, following beams of radar like invisible rails. Factories that had survived years of war were finally obliterated. Fuel depots exploded. Train lines vanished. Even jet assembly plants, hidden in mountain tunnels, were systematically located and destroyed. The Germans tried to strike back with desperation. They launched rocket-powered interceptors, built suicide bombers, experimented with guided missiles. But none of it mattered. Every secret they created was already being read, analyzed, and neutralized. The Luftwaffe wasn't just losing. It was being outthought, move after move. Inside Berlin's air ministry, panic turned to disbelief. The reports didn't make sense. Pilots claimed their engines were failing midair, instruments giving false readings, navigation systems behaving as if possessed. They didn't know that Allied scientists had begun perfecting magnetic interference, devices that distorted compasses, misled guidance, and disrupted radio beacons. The sky itself was being rewritten. By the time Germany realized the scale of what was happening, it was over. The Allies had won not just through superior numbers or machines, but through mastery of the unseen. And yet, for the few Luftwaffe pilots who survived, the final months of the war were something beyond defeat. They were haunting. They would later describe missions where their entire squadrons vanished into clouds, never to return. They spoke of radar screens lighting up like Christmas trees, hundreds of false targets, noise everywhere. They'd fire flares into empty air, only to find Allied fighters diving on them from nowhere. It wasn't magic. It was mathematics, physics, and the quiet genius of men and women who'd never fired a shot. Because behind every Allied bomber, there were unseen heroes, the scientists who cracked codes, the engineers who built jammers, the analysts who predicted German moves before they happened. The war in the air had become a chess game played in 4 dimensions: speed, space, sound, and signal. And Germany never saw the board. As Allied forces advanced across Europe, the Luftwaffe's last defenses broke. Pilots without fuel abandoned their aircraft. Jet fighters, symbols of German innovation, were destroyed on the runways before they could take off. Airfields turned into graveyards of twisted metal and broken dreams. And then, one morning in April 1945, the skies over Berlin filled once more, but this time only with Allied planes. There was no reply. No formation of Messerschmitts, no defiant roar, only the hum of engines and the falling of bombs. The Luftwaffe, the air force that once conquered half a continent, had been erased. But this wasn't just the end of Germany's air power. It was the birth of something new, The 7 moves that brought down the Luftwaffe didn't just win the war. They redefined warfare itself. Radar, code-breaking, electronic countermeasures, global logistics, high-octane fuel, jet propulsion. These became the foundation of the modern age. Every satellite, every guided missile, every stealth aircraft in the decades to come would trace its lineage back to these invisible victories. The Allies hadn't just defeated Germany. They'd stepped into the future. And yet, even in defeat, the lessons endured. German engineers, captured after the war, would bring their knowledge to the very nations that had beaten them. The scientists behind the Me-262 would later work on American and Soviet jet programs. The radar pioneers of Britain would lead the dawn of the computer age. And the men who once broke the Enigma code would go on to create the first digital computers, machines that would forever change how wars and peace were fought. When historians later examined the fall of the Luftwaffe, they didn't just see a military failure. They saw a philosophical one. Germany had built its air force on domination. The Allies built theirs on adaptation. Germany trusted might. The Allies trusted minds. And in the end, brains outflew brawn. The 7 moves that Germany never saw coming were not born in the sky, but in quiet rooms, filled with the hum of machines, the scratching of pencils, and the determination to survive. They weren't flashy. They weren't dramatic, but they were decisive. Move 1, radar, seeing the unseen. Move 2, countermeasures, blinding the enemy. Move 3, global airfields, turning the world into a runway. Move 4, 150 octane fuel, the chemical edge that gave wings to the Mustang. Move 5, electronic deception, the art of confusion. Move 6, the jet race, innovation strangled by strategy. Move 7, code-breaking, turning knowledge into power. Each one a blow, each one invisible, together unstoppable. In the end, Germany's warplanes didn't just fall from the sky. They were pulled down by the weight of their own overconfidence. And when the smoke cleared, the world had learned a new truth. The greatest victories aren't won by strength, but by vision. The war in the air ended not with a dogfight, but with a whisper, a signal echoing through the void, carrying one timeless lesson. In every battle, the side that sees first wins. The skies over Europe would never look the same again, and neither would the future of war.